but it's... This is RSBANDB Update, monthly bit number 6, the Trekkie special. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this very special episode of RSBANDB Update. And yes, this is indeed being released to everybody on Christmas Day. This is our Christmas gift to the community this year. I said we were going to have a surprise for everyone, and what that surprise is that our monthly bit for December has now arrived and is available to everybody, regardless of whether or not you are one of our supporters on Patreon. And since it's the Christmas season, I have some people here who are very joyful and jolly at times, and that is, of course, Earth and Trekkie joining us.
Surprise, bitch.
Well, how long did that take, Shane?
Not very long, but...
Hey, Shane.
Shane, hold up.
What's that?
My clock says it's December 20th.
We are pre-recording this in advance for Christmas. Yes.
So we're not even doing this live for our listeners? Okay,
no, I'm not doing a podcast on Christmas Day.
Wow.
So Shane,
see where your priorities are at.
Shane,
I probably have family things happening as you guys are listening to this. But in any case, Trekkie,
hey Shane.
Hi.
Before we move forward, did you press the record button?
Yes, I did press the record button.
Okay, because I'm not re-recording this again for the second time.
Yeah, we do press the record button, and you're probably wondering about the topics of this, and, you know, this is something we wanted to do for years. I think we first outlined the idea of having a show like this back in 2014 or something absurd like that, and it took us that long. Yeah, I think it was 2014 when we first floated the idea of it, and what we want to do is we want to run through something that is very, very important to us in terms of just something that we spend a good portion of our time consuming, and that is Star Trek. You know, since the beginning, it's been a central part of RSBANDB Update. There's been many references on the podcast each and every week, show titles, and it's very important to many around RSBANDB. And we are, of course, gathered here today with Trekkie and Earth, or Reed as we sometimes call him, where well, I mean, on the podcast. And what we're going to do this week, or this month rather, is we're going to go through Star Trek, why it is what it is, why we like it, the most important episodes in the entirety of the franchise, and our favorite episodes. And I think we can have a look and see that the favorite episode section was very hard for some of us.
Some.
Shane literally had, Patrick counted how many?
204.
Out of like 700 episodes that have ever been released
that I could talk about or had some memory of why it might be on the list. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about why we like it, why certain episodes are important, and our top 5 favorite, and then round it off by talking a little bit about the movies and where Star Trek's going in the future, and we'll wrap it up and leave it there. Now, there's one important note that I want to say with this, is that about Star Trek Discovery. Since Discovery is the newest series, I've only watched it once, Trekkie's only watched it once, and Reed here has not watched Discovery yet, so I didn't feel as though I was ready to formulate an opinion on the series, and I didn't think it would be fair to bring in a segment of the show that Reed could not talk about.
Y'all should try Orville. There, I said it.
No, I don't think the Orville is Star Trek. I think that is a parody.
You haven't, Shane? You didn't even bother watching one episode.
That's because I don't like parody.
Uh-huh.
But anyways.
You're a walking parody, Shane.
Thank you. So,
All right.
moving on into...
Spore Drive. You call that not a parody? Come on.
I said we're not discussing Discovery and the Spore Drive.
He's not doing it because I'm going to make fun of the Spore Drive.
Oy, oy, oy. All right. Anyways, so I wanted to talk a bit about why we like Star Trek. I figure a good point to start off with that is how did we get into it? So I think we'll start with Trekkie on that one.
Why I gotta start with it?
It's your name.
Well, I like Star Trek. Honestly, I think I remember the first time when I was a wee lad in the early 90s, probably like the age of 7. I was channel surfing at night with the antennas trying to make sure the TV was working. And I actually ended up on Star Trek Star Trek The Next Generation. I was like, oh, this is cool, spaceships. Yay! And of course, nobody else in my family liked it, so every time it was on, as they changed the channel, fine. So, but a couple years, good decade later, I remember I was channel surfing one night because WWE wrestling was just over and I had nothing else to watch. And I'm like, hey, there's a Star Trek thing. What's this? I was like, oh, and it was Voyager, and that's literally what got me back into watching Star Trek.
And it's fair to note that Star Trek first started in 1966. The following series, The Next Generation, was 1987, and there was a bit of a break in the TV series between then, but there was movies in the 80s and whatnot. Now, in regards to me, how I got into it, you could call Star Trek, for me, very much a family affair. Both my parents watched it growing up, and as for me, it apparently was one of the first TV shows I watched when it premiered in September of 1987. Obviously, I don't remember that back then. I was of course born in 1987, but it was something that my dad watched with me from the very beginning. So you could say that that's how I got into Star Trek, and it's just been something that's stuck with me ever since, all the way through Next Generation and everything that we have going on today with Discovery. So that's my origin story on it. How about you, Reed?
You pestered me into watching it.
And you liked it.
Didn't like that tone, but yes.
There we go. Now, another thing that I really enjoy about the series is that, in general, the franchise, is that it tackles modern issues through the lens of other cultures, and this could be anything from societal, political, or cultural issues that are tackled. And the interesting part about this, after you watch a few of the episodes, is it doesn't feel as though that they're outright tackling these issues, but by the end of the episode, everything wraps up, and it's relatable in these cases to something that is being talked about today in the modern world. At least most of the time.
Yeah, and I also actually wonder if this is it. I remember last year you were to find video clips of Star Trek things we're going to talk about for this podcast. It never came to fruition.
Yeah, that was something we were going to do, a video version of it. But I figure we have the text and discussion here that can handle most of this. How do you guys feel about how Star Trek handles modern issues and the like?
I think some things will be timeless.
Yeah.
You can watch those things and relate back to it one way, shape, or form.
Yeah. I think DS9 did it best. Deep Space Nine. But I feel like some of the original series episodes did it well, too. But not as well as DS9. Particularly... do we want to bring in specific episodes yet?
You can mention them, and then we'll discuss the episodes more after.
All right. Well, it's Homefront and Paradise Lost. Those were the ones on Earth, right?
Correct.
Which ones were the Bell Riots?
That was past tense.
Past tense.
You have to love the fact that Shane actually memorized all of these episodes with the titles.
I mean,
I did use Memory Alpha for some of the lists. I will give you that, just to know what was all there. And that's something that you don't get in most series today, even series that are done today, is that you can have episodes that are done in the 1960s or the 1990s, and they're still relevant today in terms of what they're talking about. Granted, the ones from the 1960s might look atrocious, but the ones from the 1990s, I think, visually have aged better than the 1960s ones, but I could potentially just be biased on
I
that.
would disagree, actually.
Okay.
Because those were recorded with film, not digitally.
Right, but Next
So the
Generation has been
remastered
remastered in Blu-ray. So,
also the drumhead.
yeah,
TNG. That's probably my favorite episode.
Very, very relevant in today's climate. Very, very relevant.
Gee.
Well, yeah,
Okay.
exactly. We'll get to that. And, another thing with this is that, you can have general action movies and action movies set in space, but it's hard to find one that does what Star Trek does, in that it's prioritizing diplomacy, focusing on problem solving, and working together to find a solution to the problem rather than just blasting through doors and killing everyone. So, and that, to me, is what sets Star Trek apart from other things. And I feel that is something that, I'm going to say this once, that drew a lot of criticism in Season 1 of Discovery, but we know why that was looking after that, and we're not going to talk about Discovery much going forward. Okay, so this is a bit of the meta view of Star Trek, and what do you guys, anything else about why you in particular like Star Trek, like the franchises and whatnot?
I think the just the social commentary is the biggest thing, because you can use it just as a metaphor. I mean, we'll get into that in a minute, but it's easier to see things in a completely different setting than something that you could see yourself being in, right?
Correct.
Like,
Correct.
I know that chances are I'm probably never going to be on a space station hundreds of light years from here dealing with a variety of alien species from the other side of the galaxy.
And that puts it in the lens where you can say, okay, this is happening there. Maybe we can relate this, or maybe this relates in some
you can take
specific
a step
way.
back.
Precisely. Now, we're going to be mentioning episodes here and whatnot. We're going to be talking about the content of some of the episodes with this. And this, in no means, is an exhaustive list of the episodes that should be watched or the order that they should be watched in. I think that's something that is deeply personal, depending on how you feel about Star Trek. Would you guys agree with that? That there's no specific way you should start?
Yeah, no specific way. But I think if you did want a starting point, starting with TNG kind of filters out through every other series. Because one thing about Star Trek that they did somewhat well is that they do bridge every series together some one way, shape, or form.
As much as I love the original series, you need to not watch it first, because except for a couple of episodes, it's just so cheesy. You have to already be comfortable with Star Trek in order to watch it.
Yes, like the episode where you fight the Gorn, and it's like, fight it!
My favorite TNG episode, one of them, it's so cheesy, but we'll talk about that later.
All right. So heading on into the most important episodes, we're going to go by series now, in which the order that the series started. And of course, that's the original series. And these lists that we're putting together right now are effectively episodes that we've curated and we agree as a group are some of the most important. So the first one is The Cage and the Menagerie, which, for all intents and purposes, is the original Star Trek pilot episode before it went to air. It started on TV with a different first episode than the one we are talking about right now. And people watching it didn't see until the second season what this first pilot might have looked like. Now,
because it was really weird.
It is, I think the simplest way of saying it is that it's just really absurd science fiction.
It is, and it's really good. I think the way that they did it with, so the original was The Cage, and it was like, I mean, I remember when I started out watching it, it was on Netflix, and that was shown as like the pilot episode. Like it was number one first right there. So I watched it, like I watched TV late at night, and I remember just being confused out of my damn mind. Like, where is Kirk? That's not Kirk? What is happening?
It was Captain
here?
Pike.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, since he didn't stay on to be the lead of the show, like wouldn't have fit anyway. But like, it's good to watch the whole thing, but they get most of it, or most of the good stuff, in the Menagerie, which they did in season 2, using clips from it. And I think the way they did it was really well done.
And it also set up lots of interesting stuff regarding the Captain Pike character, which we haven't learned about yet.
Oh, so we're not going to talk about what this episode entails?
No,
you just base it to the name.
No, you can talk about what the episode entailed. I watched this years ago. I don't remember it in its entirety.
Actually, I remember watching this on YouTube back when Star Trek was free. I was like, oh, hey, it's here. Cool. So I remember, what was it? It was basically binge watching a little bit of Star Trek, the original series, while trying to finish that one last science lab homework before class tomorrow. But in a nutshell, what happened with this episode is Captain Pike, who was the original captain of the Enterprise, and if it makes you people who are listening feel a little better, I'm kind of wikiing this right now to refresh the memory. He was injured in a horrible accident, and he's basically put into a big black wheelchair that beeps for him, because God knows why they have non-info technology that let people talk. But I digress. But basically what happened was Spock, who is the first officer or science officer at the time, it wants to go and try and save Pike's life, basically, instead of him being a vegetable. So Spock basically tricks Captain Kirk and everybody else that, oh, hey, we're going to a top secret mission, complete radio science, when they're going back to a planet that is banned by the Federation, because it's actually a very dangerous area to be. And
it's the only death penalty still on the books at that time, apparently.
And in a nutshell, they basically did do a giant clip show of the whole thing. So you'll see a whole bunch of little, quote unquote, flashbacks from Spock and everything else over this. And, you can give the episodes a watch. But they reached the planet. They're on a mission to reach the planet. And at the same time, they're telling a story of what happened with their first visit many decades ago.
And, this is something Star Trek has done a few times. It's what we call those bottle episodes. Some of them, I think this is probably the most successful bottle episode of Star Trek.
You do know why they do clip shows, right?
Yeah, because they didn't have the resources, or there was some kind of writer strike going on at the time.
No, it's because it's a lot cheaper to just here, slice this in, than it is to make a whole new scene.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
It's what everyone considers as the budget episodes.
Sure. All right. Anything else on The Cage and the Menagerie?
Not really.
Aliens got big giant heads.
Yeah, and keep in mind, everything you watch in the original series was 1960s, so it's just going to look hilarious.
It's cheese-tastic, which is why you shouldn't watch it first.
Next up is Mirror Mirror, which is Star Trek's first Mirror Universe episode from Season 2 of the original series. And basically what happens with this one is there's a transporter accident that sends them into this parallel universes, and it's a classic discussion of what would your evil twin do, and everybody in the mirror universe has an opposite, which is bent on conquering and destruction and just pure being evil. So with that being said, I think Mirror Mirror deserves credit for opening up the mirror universe, which was actually more developed in Deep Space Nine rather than anything else. Following this. And I think in general, based on what we've seen so far, Mirror Mirror in itself talks about how humans on their own can be inherently evil. And keep in mind, this is the 1960s, and this is one of those first concepts that still rings true today. And I didn't initially appreciate this about the Mirror Universe. It took some other things with the Mirror Universe to get me on side with that. But I really like all Mirror Universe episodes following recent Star Trek events. So I think, did I miss anything with Mirror Mirror? Anyone want to put anything else in?
I don't think so.
All right. Next up is Space Seed. And if you've watched Star Trek before, you'll know what Space Seed is. Space Seed deals with Khan, otherwise known as the major supervillain from the movie Star Trek II. But at the time in the 60s, of course, no one knew that this one-off episode character would devolve into such a character for the entirety of the series and effectively reboot the Star Trek movie franchise, because that's what Wrath of Khan did in 1982 when that came out. But what's more, also with Space Seed in season 1 of the original series, it asked a question that we're actually just starting to think about now, and that's what should happen and what could be the potential downsides of genetically re-engineering the human race. Because if you guys have been following the news recently this year in 2018, you'll know that the first genetically modified baby was born.
I did not know that.
Yeah,
actually.
they fixed, I forget what the disease was, but it was in China, and they genetically modified the baby to not have the disease.
And they actually expands on this concept in the Enterprise. There was a two-parter that was actually very good, but it brings into question about like genetic modification for babies and human species as a whole as we evolve.
And I just want everybody to think at this moment, in the 1960s, who would have thought that genetic manipulation was something that we would see in the next 50 years in some degree or another?
Well, they also thought that by 2010 we'll have flying cars. We're still waiting for flying cars and jetpacks.
Right. We got to get the electric cars down first before that. But I think Space Seed is probably my favorite episode of the original series, if I had to put one down. Actually, maybe not. That might be the next one.
Didn't you put down like 204 episodes?
I did. You guys good with Space Seed, or do you want to move on to The City on the Edge of Forever?
I'm good with Space Seed. Yeah, I'm good with Space Seed.
Trekkie, you want to explain The City on the Edge of Forever?
Let me relook that one up really quick. Okay. Which one was that one?
Basically,
it's the one where they go back to the 1930s.
Yes.
Me.
Okay.
What?
Me.
You didn't like that one?
Is that the one I'm thinking of?
It's the one with the gateway.
Yeah,
where McCoy went crazy because he stabbed himself with his own medicine.
Yeah, that's
I thought the episode was cool, but it was the ending that kind of bothered me. That was just me.
Okay,
it was supposed to.
Exactly, it's supposed to. So basically what happens in this episode is that, as Trekkie said, McCoy, who is the doctor, accidentally injects himself with a very powerful drug, cordrazine. And what ends up happening with this is that at the meantime, the Enterprise is in orbit around the planet that has something that we're just going to call the gateway. And McCoy ends up going down to the planet. But what's not known at this point in time is that the gateway can also transcend time and space. And this sends him back to 1930s Earth. And being the doctor that he is, the question is asked for him. He sees this woman about to get hit by a car in the street. He ends up saving her. But in saving her, he completely alters the timeline for some reason. And because of that...
Butterfly effect,
their future doesn't develop as it's supposed to. And this is what bothered Trekkie, is that they had to ultimately make it so at the end of the day, this woman ends up dying.
Oh, that wasn't the issue that was bothering me, but that's something totally different.
What ended up bothering you?
What issue?
I can't remember. I remember watching it the first time and something just like annoyed the bejeebus out of me. Can't remember what it was.
Okay.
All right.
Because it's objectively the best episode of TOS, so...
Yeah, and, this... I don't know if... Like, obviously, when it comes to talking about these and the history that was changed with this, in this alternate history that they created, Nazi Germany went on to win the war because they came back to 1930s because of this. So...
Well, yeah, and I guess we shouldn't spoil it, but you'll figure it out. But what was the other one where they actually went to another planet and the owner actually made the whole planet like a Nazi-led government thing?
Oh, that's one of the cheese episodes.
Yeah, I don't remember the name. I think it was probably season 3.
I'll look it up, but it was
Patterns of Force.
Was that a two-parter?
No, there were no
Season 2,
two-parters.
episode 21.
Okay.
City on the Edge of Forever and the Menagerie are the only two-parters, right?
No, City on the Edge of Forever is not a two-parter.
Really?
Nope, it's one episode.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking that too when I watched it, is that it felt like it was 2 episodes. But it's 1.
No, it is 1, Reed.
But yeah, okay, I see Patterns of Force now. That was obviously a filler, and that's the general sense that you get with the original series, is that there's lots of episodes that fill in the gaps in between and whatnot. Now, another interesting episode that was in the original series was called the Tholian Web. And, we never heard anything of the Tholians until 2004 with Enterprise.
No.
Well, I mean, we heard of them in passing, but we didn't see them until then.
True, but they also did an episode of that in The Next Generation too. Although it wasn't about them, they were more like a side civilization.
Okay.
It was the one where Picard went to the holodeck and somehow another holodeck malfunctioned while he was playing Dick Grayson or whatnot. Not Dick Grayson. Why do I call it Dick Grayson?
Dixon Hill.
There we go.
Okay.
And they mentioned they were going to meet the Tholian delegates.
Oh, right. Of course, they did mention that. Right. So it was
they mentioned it.
Past.
They just never bothered touching that.
Never bothered to show them. So the Tholians are one of the few species that you hear about, but you only ever see them once or twice on screen and then in passing a couple of times. And this was an interesting episode. And I don't know which of you guys suggested we put the Tholian web on this most important TOS episode.
That was me.
Okay. Is it because of what we saw in Enterprise?
No.
Okay. Well,
it's just the best. So season 3, you need to give some background here for what happened, right?
Sure.
In the real world.
All right. What specific event are you thinking of?
Wasn't that when they forced Roddenberry out or something?
Oh yeah, season 3.
That
correct.
Correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
Season 3. The majority of the episodes were pretty bad.
And they were not under the direction of Gene Roddenberry. And, of course, Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek. But the Tholian Web, I think, stands out to me as a good episode. And what ends up happening in that episode is that they encounter another Constitution-class starship, the USS Defiant. But in terms of sending people over there, they send Kirk and Spock over there, but Kirk is not able to come back, so they assume he's dead. But it turned out to just be a transporter malfunction at the end of the day. But I think where the Tholian Web comes in as being a good episode is that it kind of set the bar for what Star Trek could do later on in its history, in that it can introduce one species or one alien, have it be an episode of the week, leave unanswered questions, and still leave the watchers that week as feeling though they witnessed something good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can say it here, but the Tholian Web and what happened to the Defiant is answered in Season 4 of Enterprise. I don't think we have that episode on any of our lists, so we'll leave that as a mystery to the listeners with this. What?
Nice.
Exactly. Anything else on the Tholian Web?
Not really.
Okie dokes.
Nah. I think Shane, if you want, I'll give you 10 seconds to do an honorable mention of any other episodes you wanted on the list, but you couldn't add it because 204 was way too goddamn long.
I'll save that for the end of the show. I have a couple on that.
Define couple.
2 or 3.
You're right.
Doubt.
So 2 or 3 seasons or 2 or 3 series?
Episodes.
All right. So
moving on to the Next Generation, which is where Star Trek became mainstream once again in the late 80s. Ran from 1987 to 2005, uninterrupted. The 3 main series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager, then Enterprise at the end, and movies pretty much every 2 or 3 years throughout that entire time period as well. So the Next Generation was the first Star Trek series to run 7 seasons, and produced many, many great episodes. And as this was the 1980s, Gene Roddenberry was involved. A good chunk of the episodes from Season 1 and Season 2 of The Next Generation are kind of rough around the edges, I think we could say.
Yep.
So if you're starting a watch-through of Star Trek and you're starting with The Next Generation, know that Season 1 and Season 2 are going to be rough around the edges at times. But we can jump right into Season 2 with our first episode that sets and follows through what we talked about earlier with what Star Trek can do, and that's The Measure of a Man. And this episode, I think we could probably say, is perhaps one of the most important episodes ever created. I think that's going to be our consensus here.
Especially in the next 100 years when we actually start dealing with this.
Correct. Now,
yeah, I for one welcome our new computer overlords.
It's basically about whether or not androids in the data in specifically is his own person.
Is he able to make a decision?
Does he have rights?
Does he have rights?
Yeah, and you'll actually see this concept kind of float into Voyager in the last season as well, or last season.
Yeah. So
last 2.
Yeah, the last season, last couple episodes of Voyager with that, and it's fair to note that Data as an android actually has an off switch. So the argument being made is that by joining Starfleet, he ineffectively became property of Starfleet. And if they want to research him, if they want to strip him apart to figure out how to make more androids like him, the organization feels that they should have the right to do so. But obviously he feels that he should have his own right to say what he wants to do. But there's one more interesting little twist in this episode, is that because the hearing happens at a remote starbase, the one who has to prosecute Data is one of his best friends, Commander Riker, the first officer of the Enterprise.
Now, I will say, I think that was like the weakest part of that episode. Like that, I didn't really buy that premise. Like I was willing to, but like, eh.
In a way, someone worked out.
Yeah, I mean, it did work out, but I thought it's kind of dumb.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, at the end of the day, he won his own rights. And this is something that, in effect, became a hallmark because his number one goal through season 1 and up to the end of the series for him was that he wanted to become more human. And this was one of the steps in that path and accomplishing that. And like we said, we're not dealing with this today, but this episode came out in 1989. And it's entirely possible in the next 20 to 50 years that we're going to have some form of artificial intelligence. And the question will be asked, should it have the right to self-determination? And this goes all the way back to 1989.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the best episodes in the franchise.
Yeah, most of these are very memorable quotes as well.
That's
I'm
right.
sure Shane remembers them without even looking at the script.
I could, but we're not going to do that.
Go for it. Do it. You got to do it for the fans.
No, we'll do it at some point later on.
Reed, make him do it.
No, it'll be fine.
Oh, no, fun.
Next episode is the season finale of the 3rd season of The Next Generation. And this one is called The Best of Both Worlds. And the interesting aspect around this one is that it involves what at the time was being built up to be a mortal threat against the Federation and, of course, Earth. And that is the Borg, a group of cybernetic beings that want to effectively assimilate everyone and take over everything. But what ends up happening with this is that Captain Picard is kidnapped, and the crew of the Enterprise has to go against Picard, who has been transformed into one of these Borg drones, and try and defeat him, and ultimately ask the question that we might need to end up killing our former captain. And as we all know, we see future seasons of The Next Generation. We know that they don't have to make that decision, but how they get there is something that I'm willing to leave as an exercise for the listeners if they want to go watch this episode. But I think it raises some interesting questions regarding whether or not the idea of the human consciousness is something that can be transplanted, and what would ultimately happen if you did need to end up in a situation where you need to kill someone that you have known forever and knows exactly how you would react. And plus, it's a major stepping point in development for the character and the rest of the series. I don't know if there's much else to say on The Best of Both Worlds, but that probably covers
it basically what shifts it's basically the episode where what really helps define DS9. Because if you think about it, when DS9 first started, the first thing was basically this episode.
Right. So without this episode, there would be no Deep Space Nine series.
Right, but it also kind of forced Starfleet to realize the idea of having basically a flying space colony full of civilians is awesome on textbook, but in reality, that's a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they started creating ships like the Prometheus and the Defiant.
And that was the difference between the Star Trek of the 80s and the Star Trek of the 60s, is that in the Next Generation, the Enterprise D, the ship that one is set on, carried families and children and whatnot, whereas in the previous series it did not, and that's the difference Trekkie's talking about. And the Borg sets up the Borg and moves the Borg, which had a huge role in Voyager and one of the movies too, but we'll get there.
The Borg. It's basically what we will turn to be. We decide to plug our brains into the internet,
which would be a really bad idea. Could you just imagine allowing Facebook to have that power?
Can you imagine me connecting to your brain, Shane?
That'd be interesting.
When I get in there, Shane, all I always see is nothing but a black void in Star Trek. Come on, Reed.
All right. Our next episode that we enjoyed and is one of the more important episodes of Next Generation is Data's Day, which basically goes through the Android experience for a day. And I think this was was this one of the first episodes you watched, Reed?
I don't remember, but the important thing here is that it's a continuation of A Measure of a Man, because at the very beginning, Data addresses it to a commander at the Daystrom Institute, if I remember correctly. So, like, even though he has won his right to, like, exist as his own independent entity, he's, like, not, just not, he's still helping, and it follows his day, and he has a lot of trouble with social interactions because he's an android, and that's like the whole I want to be more human thing, right?
Yeah.
So it just follows his day.
And
it's really neat.
It is really neat. There's one scene in this one, two of the crew members are getting married, and he receives news that the wife has canceled the wedding. So Data goes to, at the time, Chief O'Brien says, "I have great news. Keiko has decided to cancel the wedding because it will increase her personal enjoyment." And this highlights the perspective that Data has, is that if it's going to make someone happy, it is probably good news. But he has to learn the hard way that no, it's not. You can't just go around saying those kind of things.
So. Technically, he was kind of coerced by her to tell her fiance about the news. And
I think that's kind of on Keiko, though, honestly.
And being the naive android he was, like, I have great news. It's like, okay, Mr. Android, sir.
But, a great episode to watch about Data, the evolution of Data, and how he approaches those social interactions. Now, our next episode is one that is very important today and has become important in the recent years, I feel. And that's the drumhead from Season 4 of The Next Generation. And what happens on this episode is that there's an explosion in engineering near the warp core. They think it's sabotage, and they're trying to figure out who did it. Initially, Romulans are suspected, and this leads to this whole witch hunt of things that are happening on board, and one of Picard's old friends comes in as a prosecutor, and they lead down this whole path of trying to figure out what exactly happened, and they end up persecuting the wrong guy purely because he had one Romulan ancestor. And when you think about it, we've seen many things like this before in the past, but this is just a general word out to everybody there that going on the witch hunt for the sake of a witch hunt to try and find a suspect, to get a suspect in a crime, is not always the best thing to do and can have dire consequences.
You need to read the quote, Shane.
Yeah, I'm actually just looking up the quote right now because I want to get it entirely
I got
right.
you, buddy.
Okay, thank you.
I got you,
I'll let
buddy.
you read it then.
No, you're reading it.
All right.
Where did it go? There we go.
Which one was this one?
You'll know when I start reading it.
Is it?
All right, so here's
I have memorized this already.
Here's the quote from Captain Picard at the end of this episode and why this episode is so important today. Quote reads as follows: there are some words I've known since I was a schoolboy. With the first link, the chain is forged. The first speech censored. The first thought forbidden. The first freedom denied changes all irrevocably. And those words were uttered by Judge Aaron Settee as wisdom and warning. The first time any man's freedom is trodden on, we're all damaged. I fear that today.
And that's when crazy judge lady cuts him off.
Because that's like her. Is that her father?
Yep.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. That's basically it. And basically throughout the entire, even though two-thirds of the way they found an explanation for the explosion in engineering, and even within, she basically would not accept it and would kept trying to go for witch hunts.
And, you know, you could tie that together, and you could bring that together with this quote. And, you know, we often talk today about freedom of speech and freedom of expression. But I feel that this quote from this episode is inherently true in that if you start censoring ideas, if you start censoring freedom of speech, you might be removing things that are uncomfortable, but you don't know what else you're ultimately limiting on. And this is, you know, once again, another episode that deals with something that was in the early 1990s, but is still very, very relevant today. And, you know, I think that if I just had to choose one episode for someone to watch from the next generation, this could pretty much be it, probably.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
All right. Next up is The Inner Light. This is one of those episodes that is deeply personal for everyone. Trekkie, you're a fan of this episode. Go for it.
Yeah, and I had it on my list. Let me get rid of it, jerk.
Well, we're discussing it now.
Well, basically, Inner Light is one of the very, very soft episode where it's like, it just makes your food nice and good, unless you're Shane. But basically what happens is... What?
It's gut-wrenching. It's so sad.
Yeah, but it basically gave us the best prop in the world.
I guess.
And the way they end the episode is kind of like a solemn nod. So basically in this episode, Picard and the Enterprise encounter a probe. The probe basically brain zaps Picard and he falls unconscious into a coma. And he's basically living the life of an alien species that apparently went extinct thousands of years ago, or hundreds, whichever case.
From a supernova.
Right. And throughout the episode, he's basically having a full life, literally a full life. Got married, had a child, grew old, was a scientist, everything, till he's like basically so old that he had wrinkles and even balder head in his head. And so basically he had a full life of being this alien in this alien race. And basically what ends up happening is, you know, the whole point of the probe was like, we needed somebody to teach about us because we're going to be gone. And that's basically what happens. And basically it comes with the best prop in the whole world, which is Picard's flute. Sadly, it doesn't really work, but to show just how beloved the little music in this episode was, they took what is basically a 25-second lullaby, turned it into a full-blown orchestra.
And what's more with that, in this episode, in playing this throughout the life that he lives, in the beginning, he could not play the flute at all. But by the end of it, he is a master of it. And that's what makes this a memento of this episode, is that because by the time we get to the end, the probe disappears and it leaves nothing except for this one artifact. No one else knows what it is, but he sees the flute, knows what it is, plays it, and that's how the episode ends. And it's also worth noting that in universe, he was only unconscious for, I believe it was around 25 minutes. And in that time, he experienced an entire lifetime. And the reason this episode is so powerful is it just sums up the general sense that as it is, life can happen in a blink of an eye. And whether that's 25 minutes or an entire lifetime, that's just how it comes down. And that's what made this episode so powerful for many people, is that everyone he knew was gone, but he had this artifact at the end, and that's all there is. Now, I wonder if we'll see this. You think we'll see this artifact in the new Picard series next year?
He kept it on his desk for the rest of the series, so I'm sure.
Well, keep in mind the Enterprise got destroyed, so whether that fluid is still intact, quote unquote, is a different story. I mean, keep in mind also he had in the episode where they did the whole his tutor found evidence of creationism and whatnot. Should have been on this list in a way.
It's on Reed's list later on.
Oh, there's an artifact where, like, hey,
it's not.
Honestly, it looks like a big fat Buddha statue, but inside it's like little minions figurines. But long story short, this is supposed to be a 2,000-year-old artifact, which ends up being in generation. Riker says, "Is this porn?" No, and throws it to the side.
Yeah, so I think the general sense is that he didn't take anything with him from the Enterprise D, from the wreck.
He took his photo album. That was the only thing he took.
Yeah, the photo album, and that's it.
But,
the Inner Light is, I think, Measure of a Man, The Drumhead, and The Inner Light would probably be the 3 Next Generation episodes to watch if you're going to watch any of them. Very good. Very nice.
Uh-oh. Why did you die?
Now, our next episode is the series finale of The Next Generation, and I put this one on the list because I feel that it is a proper Next Generation movie and send-off. Plus, it also serves to answer a question about what would happen and what can happen if people open their minds to new possibilities and new ideas, which is something that this episode forces Picard to do in discovering that there is a paradox in place where he is eventually... Should I say it? Should I say what it's about, or should I leave it?
When do you find out in the episode?
Near the tail end.
I wouldn't.
Okay. We'll leave it as this one as an exercise for the listeners again. But let's just say there's a paradox, and Picard needs to open his mind and open himself up to new ideas to realize what's happening. And this goes all the way back to the series opener in that it involves the omnipotent being known as Q. And
it's a letter of the alphabet. That's all I know.
Yeah, I know we were supposed to. I wanted to put one Q episode somewhere in this list. So.
Well, you had 204 episodes to sort through that.
That's right. Anything else on Next Generation in terms of most important episodes?
Not for me.
Which one was the one where Galen makes an appearance?
His professor.
No, not that one. When Picard acts like a bounty hunter.
Oh, Gambit, season 7.
Right. I think that one's a good 2-parter. At least for me, I thought that was kind of cool.
That was going to be on my list as well.
You have everything on your list, Shane. Why are you not working?
But that one addressed Picard's love of archaeology and how ancient artifacts and whatnot hold meaning, and in this case ended up being a weapon of power. So that was a fun episode too. I enjoyed that one.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so if that was something, I think it's time to buckle up and talk about Deep Space Nine, because these episodes just jumped out, and these were the ones we knew we had to have here right away.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one in Deep Space Nine, well, I should say, for anybody who hasn't watched it before, Deep Space Nine is the series that follows the Next Generation and started while Next Generation was still running. As Trekkie mentioned, the setup for the first episode of Deep Space Nine related to the best of both worlds, and that formulated a lot of the character of Captain Sisko going into the first couple seasons of Deep Space Nine. But on its own, talking about these, I think we can say that that Deep Space Nine had perhaps some of the biggest and widest reaching ramifications for some of these episodes, right?
Yes.
And one of the first episodes we want to talk about is called Duet, from season 1 of Deep Space Nine. And it's important to note that as the series Deep Space Nine got running and as it got going in universe, the planet and space station that Deep Space Nine is orbiting was under occupation by a hostile species known as the Cardassians for the previous 50 years. And as such, the Bajorans who were being occupied held a great deal of ill will towards the Cardassians because their planet was plundered, they were abused, and they just weren't treated very well. Now, Duet is interesting because what happens in this episode is that you end up in a situation where this Cardassian, who was a part or was at the very least tangentially related to the occupying force of Bajor, appears on the space station, and there's a question asked by the Bajoran contingent on the space station: is this guy a war criminal? But as it turns out, he is suffering from an illness, and it goes through this entire arc of not wanting to help him, trying to prosecute him for his war crimes and whatnot. But at the end of the day, it's revealed that no, this guy wasn't a war criminal. But, oh boy, even though the characters know that, and even though it has been established through evidence, it is still very, very hard to stop hating. And that's what makes this episode so powerful.
And basically is, when does your enemy stop being your enemy?
Right. Even if this guy didn't do anything to you or didn't do anything to his family, he's a part of that species. When does that stop? And, this was something that was still a bone of contention in the original series episodes too, because, the original series 1960s, mid-1960s, 20 years after World War II ended, they had a Japanese pilot at the helm of the Enterprise in 1966.
And he never crashed either.
That's right. Oh, you're not...
Like, Troy!
Right. Anyways, back to Duet. I think, Season 1 of Deep Space Nine was a bit off in terms of getting started. It got started slow, but Duet would probably be the strong point of that season, I think.
Yeah.
And, it really showed what Deep Space Nine could be and all of the critical messaging that Deep Space Nine would do going forward. So Duet is definitely an important episode of Deep Space Nine. And, as with everything we've been talking about here, carries lessons that can be used in the real world. And granted, it's hard for some people to put themselves in this situation, but seeing it through the lens of a different culture and a different species can make people think differently. And that's why Duet's so important. Next episode, Past Tense. I know, Reed, you mentioned this one previously, so I'll let you explain Past Tense.
This is the Bell Riots
Correct.
one? Where to begin? Basically, Cisco gets thrown back in time to
So like
Earth.
2005 or so.
Yeah, something like that. And talks about these sanctuary cities where a bunch of people are just crammed in there. And the biggest thing there is it's race relations, yeah?
Yeah.
Isn't that the big one?
Yeah, and in general, modern-day society's ability to have a problem and say, it's out of sight, it's out of mind, no issue.
And it's also one of those, what's the word I'm looking for? Non-desirable people.
Yeah, because it dealt with homeless and whatnot, too.
Mm-hmm.
And, they had no idea. Like, they had read about the history of the early 2000s. It was around 2025 or so. And they had no idea how people were treated at that time. And coming from the 24th century, this was a shock for these people because they got thrown back through a transporter accident. But again. But this is the theme with Star Trek. the theme of the episode is not the transporter accident. It's what happens because of the transporter accident. And, it bubbles up to a point where the people inside these sanctuary districts need a change. And it bubbles up so much that, as we mentioned, there was something going on called the Bell Riots. And the character or the person who was supposed to be involved with these riots ended up being killed because of our folks' interactions who came from the 24th century. So these guys need to go forward and set the timeline right by ensuring that the riots happen. And this is one of those time travel episodes where something changes, but they need to make it right just so that their own future still will happen. Mm-hmm. And, I think... Go ahead.
Which I think also goes with the idea of one of the other paradoxes is, well, you would then assume that this actually happened before the transporter accident, because if it didn't happen, then how would they even get onto TV? Because if you think about it, they had no way of going onto TV and broadcasting to the entire world about how badly they're treated and everything else, unless Dax was there. So who was the quote unquote the original person's contact on the outside then?
Yeah, sometimes time travel in Star Trek, you just got to accept it.
I mean, I think it worked.
Yeah, it did. It could have been more egregious.
I don't think that's a plot hole because everything changed.
Yeah. And also, like in couple, I think next season or so. With the Martians, there's a little Easter egg about it.
Oh, there was. Okay, well,
that's don't you remember when the Ferengis went to Earth?
Yeah, I remember that episode.
Yeah, there was a little Easter egg on it.
Oh, okay, I missed.
You didn't catch that?
No. What was the Easter egg?
What's his name? Nog had a data pad of Earth history, and he's like, Uncle Quark.
Oh, right.
Look at this. This looks just like Captain Mitchell. Oh, he must look the same.
But it was because they changed the history with that. And, past tense is something that, once again, we're still grappling with today. It's not as bad as it was in the episode, but there are cities that do have this problem. And this episode shows how things could be dealt with and how you don't want to deal with them. So... Alrighty, our next Deep Space Nine episode is a two-parter that had two different names to it, one for each episode, Homefront and Paradise Lost. And this episode came out in the late 1990s, but became very important post 9/11 with the crackdown on terrorism. And the general sense of what happens on this episode is that there are a bunch of changeling infiltrators from the Gamma Quadrant, the other side of the galaxy, who come to Earth to try and cause havoc, and this spurs a huge, giant security crackdown, when in reality it turns out that it's an internal conspiracy on this episode at the least. And it's just a very good discussion about whether or not it's security for the sake of security, or if it's security for the sake of a military leader somewhere to just try and want to do something about a threat that may or may not exist. And it's a discussion that was had on this episode in the 1990s and is still relevant today in the post 9/11 terrorism world. And I think that's all we have to say about this one, unless you guys have anything else. Oh boy, this next one, Waltz. This one was certainly something, and I didn't understand it until my second or third watch through of it. But this is an episode I almost feel like it warrants a whole discussion into the character itself, but we probably don't have time for that, do we?
Which one is this?
This is the one where Captain Sisko and Gul Dukat are marooned.
Crash into the planet.
Oh.
And where Gul Dukat, which is another Cardassian who kind of goes completely crazy.
Yeah, but
no, go ahead.
It's hard to know. Is this an episode? And this is something I still talk about with this one. Is this an episode about mental health, or is this an episode about your enemy, What exactly is it?
It's about after a great tragedy, you're trying to find purpose.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think that kind of somewhat sums it up.
So mental health, tragedy, and see, I could say what it was, but I'll just say that Gul Dukat experienced a great tragedy at the end, or rather at the start of season 6 of Deep Space Nine, and this sent him completely off to the rails, to the point where up until this episode he was in Starfleet prison and he was being transferred, but his prison ship got attacked and he ended up spending time with Captain Sisko marooned on a planet. But what ultimately comes from this is that Gul Dukat has gone insane because of this, and it's just a really interesting discussion because there's only 2 characters for the majority of this episode on screen, but the way it's set up, it feels as though there are multiple different personalities at stake, and that's because there were. And I think this is an important episode just because it highlights where the series ultimately ends up going for its final season. So.
Yeah, and what the episode does, it's that you're introduced to Gul Dukat in the very beginning, or Legate Dukat, depending on what he wants to call himself every other episode, and you actually sense the kind of the tension, but you're the enemy of what's the word I'm looking for? You're not my friend, but I need to keep you close, keep my enemies close, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you notice that those two, Sisko and him, have always had a thing against each other, always kind of like trying to outsmart each other
and throughout
the entire series.
And they always will. And this is where this really develops. And I think the reason I put this one in here is just because this is a very important piece for the development of these 2 characters, and that's something that Deep Space Nine does really, really well in this perspective. And if you were to watch Deep Space Nine just for the Gul Dukat episodes, that would be entirely worth it in itself, I think.
Correct.
All right, our next episode from Deep Space Nine is one called Far Beyond the Stars. And, Deep Space Nine was the first Star Trek series to outwardly tackle the subject of religion, and this is done through the Bajorans and their gods that are called the prophets. And in this episode, Sisko has an orb experience, which is effectively interacting with the prophets, and he is sent back to 1950s New York.
I like this episode.
As a black person, Benny Russell, trying to get his comic published in a paper. And that very premise in itself, 1950s New York, black African-American male, says I think all you need to know about this episode and where it goes.
Or be female.
Or being female, too. Because, of course, there is a newsroom and there are females around. And it deals with these stereotypes, how Benny Russell, which has the body of Captain Sisko, wants to deal with all these stories and has the same mentality that Captain Sisko has from the 24th century, but brings that to 1950s New York as this other character. And that's a big shock for everyone there in the newsroom, and they can't understand why he's like that. But for those of us watching, and for what we know of the captain himself, that's just par for the course. That's how it is to be normal, be accepted, be an equal member of society in the 24th century. And it just shows the difference as to what it was like in 1950s New York, if you're an African-American or a woman, as you mentioned, Trekkie, comparing it to even how it would be today and how it is in the 24th century for them. And it's just great commentary on 1950s race relations. So.
And in a way, it kind of filters out into the current timeline, because at the same time, the Bajorans having issues with Romulans, and the whole idea is always never ever trust a Romulan.
Yeah.
And the sad part is all that stuff actually played out. Couldn't trust a Romulan to save you.
Far Beyond the Stars is a good episode. Ray, do you have anything on this one?
Um, Not really, other than it's something different than normal Star Trek, but it's really good in its own way. It's not a typical, you're in space episode, right?
Right.
So,
All
and same with past tense.
Yeah. Okay. Next up is In the Pale Moonlight. And I think for myself, this is probably, if I had to make a list and put one episode on it to be the best episode ever in Star Trek, it would be In the Pale Moonlight. Who here agrees?
That's the general consensus.
Okay. In the Pale Moonlight. And as you can tell from the deep breath there, we are going to be talking about a substantive subject matter.
Do we have to?
Yes, we do, because what's happening in this episode is that Starfleet and the humans are embroiled in a war with the Dominion, who is from the Gamma Quadrant and came over to our side of the galaxy. And the war is not going very well. So through the countless casualty reports and whatnot that end up being posted, Sisko ends up going to look for a solution to bring the Romulans into the war. And he has this idea to get something started at the beginning, but he doesn't exactly know how far it's going to go. And for all intents and purposes, this episode is not on record as ever happened, because the log he's writing throughout this entire episode ends up being deleted at the end of it. So there should be no record in his own logs and in Starfleet history of what actually happened here. But what we see and what we witness shows a classic discussion of the ends justify the means. And I think that's what makes this episode so good.
Mm-hmm.
And it's meme-tastic.
Yes, it is. Why is that?
It's a fake!
Yeah, it's one of the best lines of this episode. And, at the end of the day, one of the quotes from this episode, this is a huge... Okay. This is a huge victory for the good guys. That's how he ends up seeing it.
Shane, okay, I'm sorry, but you are not Avery Brooks, and you delivering that is... You can't do it.
I don't think anyone can.
They have to watch
So,
it.
this is a huge victory to the good guys.
You're getting there, but if anyone but Avery Brooks delivers that, it's an insult to the quote, and I cannot have that.
All right.
Because the way he does it, and the way just everything about his just expressions and body movements,
and you can tell how the whole... Sorry, go ahead.
You can't just imitate it. You have to watch it for yourself.
Yeah, you're right.
I know. That's why I said it.
And you also see just how disturbed the whole ordeal was to him until he basically expressed himself through the log.
Yeah, and there's a case in this one where he ends up knocking the guy who initially suggested the idea and carried it out flat on his butt. And you don't see him do that in any other episode. That's the level of anger we're talking about in this.
Well, he intimidates Worf.
Disagree. He punched Q. I think that's just objectively wrong.
Okay.
Well, Q was asking
Q
for it.
was asking for it, and the stakes weren't as high.
And also, yeah, well, you guys will watch that episode when you guys watch it. Anyway, let's move on to Voyager.
In the Pale Moonlight, best episode of all of Star Trek, and we had that quote there, but there are many other quotes throughout that episode. Everyone needs to watch that. If you're going to do one thing, watch one episode after listening to this. Watch In the Pale Moonlight. All right, so moving on to Voyager, we have a number of Voyager episodes. The first one I wanted to just mention is Tuvix, which is another transporter accident. Did you guys like this episode when you first saw it?
No.
No, okay.
Thought it was one of the worst episodes of Voyager, if I'm being quite honest with
Okay.
you.
I put this one on
Right.
the list then. What do you think, Trekkie?
I thought it was okay when I first watched it. Watching it again, I see more connections over what's going on.
Yeah. All right. Now,
Like, I'm not on board with the whole, oh, Janeway's a horrible person.
No.
She should have kept it the
Yeah.
same way. Like, no, that's stupid.
what happened in this
Like-
episode is 2 crew members were merged with the transporter. And the merged crew member started to develop a personality and relationships with the rest of the crew. And the question was, of course, a very ethical one or unethical one, depending on your perspective. Should the captain have the right to effectively kill this new crew member and split them apart back into their original 2 crew members? And that's the debate that's had. And I think we can all see the parallels that could have with life in the real world. So I found Tuvix interesting, and I find it a interesting point of discussion. I personally am in the camp that I feel that she made the right decision in that regard, unlike some people on the internet. Not you guys, of course.
Well, quite honestly, if they only had one cast, they would have saved more money.
One what?
Yeah. I mean, even
Oh,
from
yeah,
a
right.
production standpoint, absolutely, like, you couldn't keep it that way. But, like, just from a general standpoint, like, I think it would have worked. Like, the procedure thing they did, like, it seemed like it had a reasonable chance of success, otherwise it wouldn't have, like, been suggested.
Correct.
So I think it ultimately failed at what it was trying to do.
Okay.
Because you can't have long-term ramifications from it, and it was never mentioned again.
All right. Fair enough.
Well, they did another Easter egg near the very end, but it was like
It
no.
was never mentioned in any
Any substantial way. It was just like mentioned.
substantial-
That was it.
Yeah, it's like, hey, this happened. Remember that? Okay, moving on. Like it fell flat because there were no long-term ramifications.
Okay.
So
Next up is Distant Origin, which is an episode that deals with a race of what we could effectively call dinosaurs set
Oh yes, I like this episode. It
in
was
the
fun.
Delta Quadrant, which is at the other side of the galaxy. And they discover some remnants of Voyager and Voyager crew members from their journeys earlier in the Delta Quadrant. And they realize that, these people are probably, or they assume that these people are from the same world where we came from. But what's learned throughout the end of it is that this species of dinosaur, they say, evolved on Earth prior to the mass extinction of the dinosaurs, developed spacefaring civilization and spacefaring technology, and when Earth was threatened, moved themselves away from Earth, and eventually, over the span of millions of years, migrated towards the Delta Quadrant. And there's this whole discussion that goes on within this group of dinosaurs. They're called the Voth, and they stand upright, and they have language. They cannot accept the fact that some of their DNA is shared with a warm-blooded species, the humans, and that they evolved on a distant world because it goes against what they called doctrine, which, when you think about it, is very similar. And, this is one of the cases of Star Trek doing linked metaphors, so to speak, where it dealt with the subject of creationism. That's the simplest way of putting this episode, is that this is the episode of Voyager and perhaps the biggest one that deals with creationism. Another one was The Next Generation, The Chase, in which Picard's archaeology professor comes in and makes a suggestion that all life in the galaxy shares a common thread marker, and they learn that there was a species that seeded life millennia ago. So these
I
are
don't really see how that's a creationism one, though. I mean, granted, it's been years since I've watched it, but like it just
the
like
chase or distant
it
origin.
literally shows that it's not criticizing creationism because what was like proposed could have happened did.
Oh, in regards to the chase.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it certainly felt that way. Maybe that might not be the best analogy. That's why it wasn't in the Next Generation list. But distant origin, people are penalized heavily for criticizing what they're calling doctrine and the initial creation of the path that the species took to where they are today in the series.
Yeah, now that one definitely is.
And is it just me, or are there fewer Voyager episodes to tackle subjects like this?
I think like the ones that Voyager did well, they did very well with.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you ever find that old Google Doc of all the episodes, I put a whole bunch of Voyager one on there.
Yeah, I actually tried to find that before we began, but I couldn't. Now, the next episode on the list, Trekkie, that you put this one in, is Nemesis.
Wait, you skip all the way to the end?
Well, no, Nemesis comes chronologically after Distant Origin.
Basically what happened with this episode, I thought it was more of an honorable mention than anything else, but basically what happens is Chakotay, one of the first officer, is brought into a alien planet where he's basically conditioned to help fight the enemy. And it kind of goes with the idea with Duet, how, I don't want to spoil it for those who want to watch it, but you'll see kind of a connection near the end. But basically it's they're grooming Chakotay to fight for them to fight the enemy, or what he perceives as the enemy.
Yeah, that was a good episode.
It's just an honorable mention.
Okay. Next episode I want to mention on this list is Timeless. And, I don't need to say exactly what happens in this episode because it can be summed up with something people have probably asked themselves before. If you could make a phone call to yourself in the past, what would you say and what would you tell yourself to do differently? And that's what this episode is all about, getting the chance to do that and make a change for the better. And worth noting, this was also the 100th episode of Voyager that aired. So they did this one there was a lot of fanfare about this one when it came out. And, I think everybody has asked themselves that before. If you could make a call to your past self, what would you say? And this episode goes through what it's like to do that and what happens in that call and what happens if that call is successful and not otherwise. So I think this was an important Voyager episode. Next up is Equinox, which is one of the season finales of season 5 of Voyager, moving into season 6. And this is the classic Star Trek episode coming about and
here it is.
being and basically forcing the question of an ethical discussion. Because what we have in this episode is we have a case where what ends up happening is that there is discovered another Starfleet ship that is marooned in the Delta Quadrant along with Voyager, though they haven't made contact with them yet. And they're wondering how these guys got so far and so fast when their ship is smaller and can't move as fast as Voyager. And they learn out that they've been conducting unethical experiments on alien beings and using the alien beings as a form of fuel. And this, of course, raises a great ethical discussion of, once again, the ends justify the means, is that if you could get home faster, if you could make your ship move faster so you don't need to be in hostile space, how far would you go to get your crew home faster? And that's a discussion that happens with Equinox.
And it's basically one of those things where it must be easy to man a ship when you have bulkhead still intact.
That's right. And there's another There's another great quote from the second part of this episode, I believe, and I'm going to pull that up right now. You remember this quote, Reed?
Which one?
Yeah, you can't say that and then what? What's the quote?
Is it the ending one?
Let's see.
What does it start with? I could probably recite it from memory.
It was about being human.
I remember that one. I can't recite it for you.
Yeah,
though.
I can't recite it either. That's why I'm looking for the exact list of it.
So it was.
I believe in you.
Actually, it's the first episode. Not the
It's the
second one.
first episode. Okay, that would
Yes.
explain it.
So and how did it go again? Our dilithium was gone. We were running on thrusters. We haven't eaten in 16 days. We had just enough power to orbit an M-class and it was M-class moon. Skip all that stuff. It was already dead. What would you have done? By doing what you swore to do no harm, or something similar like that.
Yeah,
There you go.
and-
It must be easy to cling
they
to.
did it a little more eloquently.
Yeah,
but
the exact quote and the part
must
that
be-
I want to
Oh,
bring
fine,
back
go.
is that it's never easy, but if we turn our backs on our principles, we stop being human.
Yeah.
It must be easy to cling to principle when you're manning a ship with its bulkheads intact, manned by a crew that isn't starving.
And it's these little moments like this that, that quote is emblematic of this entire two-parter episode, and it shows what the discussion is on this episode and the path to eventual resolution of the problem. That's what makes this such an important episode in Voyager.
And just to mini wrap this thing up, if you ever watched the last scene, watch the whole episode first, and then if you rewatch the last scene, you'll notice one thing about the camera is that you notice the camera never cuts away. So if you watch the whole thing from when she is disciplining the crew all the way to the end credit, you'll notice the camera never cuts away. It never moves away from Janeway at all. She's always the center of the shot, and it's actually a nice little camera Hollywood thing if you look at it objectively.
I didn't notice that about that shot. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think I remember now, though.
Mm-hmm. All right.
All right.
The next one.
Next up is another Voyager episode, Critical Care, and I think Trekkie could explain this one because this is something that we've chatted about a lot.
Yeah, and basically what happens, the Doctor gets kidnapped, or since particularly he's a hologram, so he gets stolen. In which case, he's brought into an alien planet to help the sick. Because apparently where he ends up is it's an area where the technology to heal people is not there. And basically what happens throughout the episode is it's a planet that has finite resources who needs help managing said resources. That includes healthcare. And what happens is you will notice there are many levels of healthcare for this space station. And you have level green, which is basically here's a Band-Aid, all the way to level blue, where care is the most critical, and they have basically state-of-the-art equipment.
And this is something that is so important in the modern world today because we're trying to figure out how to allocate healthcare best to everyone, and this. I think the focus on this episode is supposed to be the American healthcare system, probably, right?
Yeah, in a way.
Yeah. So, and this is one of those episodes where we've said it before. You watch it as an outsider. This is this thing happening in a different culture, but you see this happening, then you can start to draw parallels to things that are happening in the real world, and that's what makes it an episode worth discussion. And the people who are involved in this episode, the crew, just can't understand why things would be that way there. So it's good discussion on healthcare. And our last Voyager episode comes from the tail end of the series, and it's author. It's kind of like Measure of a Man, but not nearly as groundbreaking because this deals with the holographic Doctor attaining his rights to try and publish the holographic story that he wrote. And it goes through an entire hearing of the process, but in the end, he is awarded the rights that a hologram should be able to publish a holonovel or a novel. And that is something that, just like the step forward for the Android rights in Measure of a Man, this carries on forward for holographic rights in author-author.
There's one more I want to do an honorable mention, but I can't remember what the episode is. It's the one with Gomo Set. Shane?
I can't help you there. I don't know which one that would be.
It's I can't remember the title of it. It's where B'Elanna gets attacked by the little insect alien thing. I think I have an idea. Can't remember the title. But basically, in a nutshell, is actually I wrote it down here on the other one that I found. Half a Life, I think it was.
That sounds about right.
Or maybe Nothing Human.
Nothing Human.
Yeah, but I think that one deserves an honorable mention. Basically, what happens is you have one of the characters is attacked by an alien, but and the doctor doesn't know how to safely remove it without basically killing both hosts. So he has to go and seek help from another individual. So he goes to holodeck to find him and do a consultation with the guy. The issue comes down is he is basically the main enemy of B'Elanna because he's a Cardassian, and basically the whole premise is, at least for me looking back at it, is while the Cardassian basically created a ton of war crimes, the real person created a bunch of war crimes. Is it wrong to use the knowledge that we found from it in order to help benefit mankind?
I don't have an answer to that question.
I actually did if we ever did that other episode, but since we're never doing that clip, doesn't matter right now. So let's move on.
Woo! All right. So let's move on to Enterprise. Enterprise, of course, was the last series prior to Discovery. Enterprise had a rough time getting started, and I know what
I'll say.
And it didn't really grow. It aged like a fine wine, let's say. I think that's the best way of describing Enterprise. So the first episode we'll mention in Enterprise is one called Stigma. And the general sentiment behind this one is that Enterprise's Vulcan crew member, T'Pol, also the first officer and science officer, has a disease where she can mind meld with other Vulcans, but initially it's not said that she had that capability going forward and that all Vulcans have it, but that the disease she had was passed on by someone that she experienced unwillingly in the start of season 1 of Enterprise. And the whole premise of this episode is that T'Pol could lose her career because she has this disease, even though she did nothing wrong, and it was passed on to her without her knowledge. And the episode title speaks for itself, a stigma regarding a disease. If you have a disease, and there's a stigma around that disease, at times in human history, you were treated differently and treated unfairly because of that. And that's what this episode deals with.
And there's some current examples of diseases that have a very big stigma on them as well.
Which ones would you say?
HIV and hepatitis C.
All right.
And maybe B.
All right. That's what I was thinking. Fair enough.
Yeah, that was a pretty blatant reference to AIDS.
Yeah. Now, this next episode of Enterprise is called Cogenitor, and it deals with an oppressed gender in this one species whose sole purpose is to help others reproduce and have children. And they are marginalized in such a way that they're effectively kept in a room for 20-plus hours a day. They're only allowed to eat. They're not allowed to learn. And they're not allowed to interact with anyone else. And, I think this is something that isn't necessarily relatable to the world today, but it raises questions about gender norms. I think that's a good way of saying it, right?
I think it was more about racism, personally.
Okay. Trekkie?
I mean, in recent years, yes, I think that also can now be applied.
Sure.
Well, it's basically what happened. It's a little bit. I say it's a little bit of racism too, because basically your whole point of this being existent is for you to make us babies. Period. That's your only duty. And apparently, Fox has pictures.
Yes, Trekkie, a doctor has pictures of how other alien organisms reproduce. And he's a doctor. He should, right?
What, in every position available?
Okay, I don't think we're going to go that direction. Now, we're going to move on to Season 3 of Enterprise. We have 2 episodes from Season 3 coming up next. The first one is Anomaly. Season 3 involves a major attack on Earth and an effort by Enterprise to hunt down and figure out what exactly happened with this attack. But in doing so, they need to go into what's effectively a lawless region of space with lots of spatial anomalies that harm ships, harm people, and make it easy for new ships to the region to fall to prey. And they learn very quickly throughout this episode that they need to either adapt and become part of the group that ends up, I don't want to say they hunt people down, but they need to adapt to the people hunting them. And at the end, the captain has to make a decision. Does he torture someone for information or does he not? And this is very emblematic of the way that Season 3 of the series goes. And when you think about it as transition towards real life. This was 2003. We were having the discussion at the time about torture as a means of getting information out of people. And, this is as blatant as it is. It's an episode about torture. It's an episode about how far someone should go. And it answers it quite well that when you need to get something done, they will, at times, make it happen. Anything else on Anomaly?
No, not really. I think we can move on to the next one.
All right.
I mean, my biggest issues with that episode are more like Scott Bakula related and not really the episode.
Okay. Our next episode also comes from Season 3, and it's called Chosen Realm, where they run into a group of people on a religious pilgrimage who ultimately end up believing that the area in which they are traversing is a part of their chosen realm, their religious holy land, so to speak. And with that, they commandeer the Enterprise, and we see the first, what we could say, suicide bombing, I guess, Trekkie in Star Trek. And it's all about the religious war that's happening back on their home world. They want to use Enterprise to try and bring about a quick end to the war. And, we, at the time, this was post 9/11, 2003, we had many examples in the past of this kind of terrorism happening. Which?
Right.
And go ahead.
The reasoning of this war, they actually mentioned is for like a quick, 10-second dialogue, will make you shake your head.
What was it?
I don't want to spoil it.
Okay. It was very simple, and you would indeed shake your head about it. And, in some ways, this could be a discussion about modern religion, I think, in some perspectives, but I don't know if I would go that far. Do you think it's right to go that far to say it's modern religion?
Nah.
No. Okay.
No.
But
I think we could potentially reach that point, but hopefully we'll figure out that, hey, if we all work together, we can make the world a much better place.
Yeah, and that's the general sense that happens in most of these Star Trek episodes. And, Chosen Realm and the entirety of Season 3 of Enterprise were after 9/11, and they did focus on that theme in general. And at this point, I'd also like to just give a quick mention to a Next Generation episode in Season 3 called The High Ground that also deals with terrorism. And both these episodes are relevant in discussions that have been had in the modern era. So, Reed, do you have anything on Chosen Realm?
I don't.
Okie dokie. Well,
Say it. Just say it.
I didn't like Enterprise personally.
That's
Sorry.
fair. That's fair.
I really think they cast the wrong person to be Captain Archer. I can't take Scott Bakula seriously.
All right. That's a fair opinion to have. Okay, moving on into Season 4, Trekkie wants to talk about the augments.
It kind of goes with the original series episode of Space Seed. And basically, how Shane mentioned earlier, hey, we're on the brink of genetic modification, and it basically brings out, because in the episode, they actually find a whole bunch of, embryos. Mm-hmm. That were frozen, that were all genetically modified and whatnot, and the new character that comes on board, who's kind of the creator of all of this, is once again modifying these embryos, and it's like, why are you doing this? Well, yeah, we don't need anger, we don't need hatred. We can remove all these out. We think of it, and it's like, but you remove who they are, and that kind of goes with what we may be heading into. If we are constantly, what should genetic modification be used for? To make a superhuman being, or just to fix flaws? But then we're fixing flaws. What are the flaws going to be? Are they purely genetic, or are we going to do a new superhuman, logic-driven human creature?
Yeah, and this was 2004, and the episode itself is definitely worth a watch, and it's going to be a question that we're going to have to ask and answer sooner rather than later in the real world. So
it's an honorable mention.
Yes, indeed. And our last Enterprise episode is what many call the real series finale of Enterprise, and that is Demons and Terra Prime. This episode deals with the classic xenophobia response. And of course, in this case, we're talking about the increasing numbers of actual aliens and different species coming to Earth as Earth gains more of a prominence on the local space scene. And there are a group of people on Earth and the surrounding colonies who want Earth to remain purely human and not necessarily have your local Vulcan or your local Andorian walking around, and instead would prefer to banish and cast them all out and move them away. And it's a discussion of xenophobia and whether or not the culture and society is better with the new arrivals or if it's better without. And that's a discussion that's also been happening today in the modern world that bears some resemblance to Demons and Terra Prime. So, very important episode there. Trekkie, Earth, Reed.
I got nothing.
It explores the mirror universe and basically the beginning of it, of the Terran Empire.
No. That's Intermirror Darkly. We're talking about Demons and Terra Prime.
Oh, is this the Mars one?
Yeah, the RoboCop guy.
Okay. Right. Well, he wasn't wrong. This is how they marketed it. And meet the actor from RoboCop. I was like, okay. I wonder how people of the new generation would know who RoboCop was. But basically, yeah. Basically, if you want, I think it's partly is that you need to have people with different ideas. Otherwise, everything stays stagnant.
Precisely. Alrighty, folks, there's our most important episodes. We are running late on time, and we each did put together our own list of episodes that we deem as our favorites. So we're just going to run through these very quickly. One sentence about each episode, okay? And I'm going to keep to that, too.
Doubt.
So, I will. Just watch me. So first up on my list is A Fistful of Datas, which is an episode from, I believe it was season 5 of Next Generation. And the whole purpose of this episode is that it's set on the holodeck. There's a holodeck malfunction, and it's just in general a silly episode to watch. So I quite enjoy it.
Is that a cowboy one?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
The next one comes from Deep Space Nine, and this is a 3-parter known as the Jem'Hadar, and then its subsequent 2 parts are The Search, where they meet the Jem'Hadar and the Dominion at the start of Season 3 of Deep Space Nine, and Deep Space Nine is not the same after this, and it is the defining moment of the series. Next up is The Reckoning from Season 6 of Deep Space Nine. And what happens in this episode is another episode where Star Trek just deals with religion and deals with faith and what people believe and whether or not they should follow that faith to the end. So it's just a pure episode where they take and tackle this subject head on, which prior to Deep Space Nine they really didn't do. Episode 4 comes from Voyager, and this is the season 3 finale of Voyager called Scorpion, where they first encounter the Borg in a meaningful way. They bring on a new crew member, 7 of 9, in the season opener, also called Scorpion, and basically changes once again the trajectory of Voyager for the rest of the season, or the series rather. And the last episode goes to Enterprise, and that is Future Tense. And I think Trekkie and Reed know why I chose this one. When this episode aired, there was zero idea what exactly was happening with this episode, where this mysterious pod that they found went. But I always like these episodes that end with a mystery. And what was very fun about this one is that the game that we play, Star Trek Online, dealt with this and answered a lot of these questions. And honorable mention on this also goes to a Next Generation episode, Schisms, that did pretty much the exact same thing with Star Trek Online. So there we go.
Oh, this was the Enterprise episode, right?
Yeah, with the pod.
Okay.
All right, so now it's me. So my favorite episodes from the original series that we didn't talk about up above. My favorite one, it's the cheesiest episode, is the Omega Glory. They're just on this random alien planet, and then at the end, one of the people walks out with an American flag as Kirk is reciting the preamble to the United States Constitution. It's just cheese-tastic, and I love it. Assignment Earth is another one. There's kind of like this secret agent-y guy. It was almost a TV show by itself. It was like a pitch for it, but that never happened, unfortunately. And Who Mourns for Adonais? And it deals with the Greek god Apollo, I think. Like, the Greek gods were aliens that came to Earth and left, and it just deals with that, and they stopped existing because people stopped worshiping them. From the animated series, it's really the only episode that's even canon from it, and that's Yesteryear, and it deals with Spock's childhood.
Nice.
From the Next Generation, the episode Parallels, it's where they deal with, this is the one with like 1 billion enterprises, right, Chin?
Correct.
You edited this list.
Yeah.
See you. So there's just a couple of amusing scenes in that, but my favorites we talked about up above. As far as Deep Space Nine, all of the episodes focusing primarily on Dr. Bashir are just So good. He's probably my favorite character in all of Star Trek. And although really, so there's Little Green Men, we talked about this briefly earlier, where a few of the characters, the alien-looking ones, are sent back in time to Earth in the middle of the Cold War. And it's just a really funny episode. Another one, all Gul Dukat episodes, but Civil Defense in particular, just because it's really funny.
I agree.
To see Gul Dukat just like shocked. And last one are all of the what's his name, Shane? I'm blanking on his name, the singer.
Vic Fontaine.
Vic Fontaine. All of the Vic Fontaine episodes.
Alrighty.
All right, and then for Voyager, I didn't like Voyager that much. Still better than Enterprise, but the Omega Directive was a good episode.
The God Particle.
For Enterprise, like I said, not a fan, but anything with Commander Shran, who was played by Jeffrey Combs, who played, among other characters, a couple of my favorite characters in DS9. So that is
a
mine.
lot.
You're up, Trekkie.
All right, so I decided to narrow it down, like Shane, to one episode per franchise. Not franchise. Shutting up. Rewind. One episode per series. So for the series, I did Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. It's basically what Enterprise copied. Basically almost the same formula in a way, just slightly better graphics. TNG, I Choose Family is basically when Picard goes back to his childhood home after the Borg attacking the way fixing
after
his
the
ship.
best of both worlds.
Yeah. For me, I decided. Well, I had another pick, but Shane told me to get rid of it. DS9, I chose Trials and Tribulations because that one's just a fun episode just to watch. And if you ever watched that behind the scenes, it's kind of funny how they created the whole thing.
They removed that from mine, Shane.
They edited in footage from the original series.
Yeah, that one was really good because
It's just a fun episode.
just because of how well they edited it in.
For Voyager, there was a good number one that I liked. Pathfinder is basically when they finally make contact back with Starfleet after being alone for so many years. What, 5 years, 6 years at this time?
Yep, around there.
And basically, the best little scene is basically the very end when they finally, contact in real time. It's kind of nice to watch. And for Enterprise, I chose Similitude because when I was watching this the very first time, at the time it was roughly 2007, around that time frame. I think it was.
Well, the episode came out in 2004, but that might have been when you were watching it.
Well, it's around that. Hey, 2000s. It's like last decade. But what happened was I remember watching this one. At the time, it was all the big rage at the time was cloning, human cloning, and organs and all that stuff. And I think just the episode really hit a lot of the big points about human cloning. So that's me.
All right. Yeah, I agree. Now we're going to talk about our favorite movie in much the same way. Trekkie, go first.
Well, I'll say Reed sometime. Reed hated them all. All right, there you go, Reed. I chose First Contact. I think it was a good little action movie. It was a little classic. I think an honorable mention for me would be Generation because the ending I thought it was quite nice how they decided to destroy the Enterprise and move on to the next one.
What?
Although how they destroyed the Enterprise was completely stupid.
Okay.
I kind of like the little ending. Why do I have to mention Regeneration?
Because that's without First Contact, that Borg Enterprise episode wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, they just threw that in there for the heck of it. That's
fan
it.
service.
All right, Shane, go.
All right. My favorite Star Trek movie, aside from First Contact, would probably be First Contact, but Trekkie took that one, is The Undiscovered Country, which is Star Trek 6.
Okay.
Yeah. The idea behind this one is that this is the final voyage, the final movie of the original series crew. They're seeing a new era of peace come about, and it's a question of, are we getting ready to finally make peace with the Klingons and everything that comes from that, and once again putting aside old demons and whatnot, moving forward, but also Shakespeare, Klingon Shakespeare. So that was fun to see as well.
I thought First Contact was alright. I thought The Search for Spock was alright. I didn't really like the movies because they were more for a general audience.
Yeah, they always have been.
Like, it wasn't... I didn't feel it was true to actual Star Trek. It was more... it was more dumbed down.
Yeah, I agree. And the J.J. Abrams movies take that to a whole new level.
Don't mention those.
Alrighty, well there you have it. This is our Star Trek episode. And if you ever want to chat about anything Star Trek related, just do send either of us a message anywhere, and we'll be happy to provide.
Either, not all three.
Oh, either, right. I thought we could use either for 3 people.
No, either or. It's 2.
Oh, so you can't use either for
use
for 3.
any of us.
Okay, all right. Send any of us a message, and we'll be happy to talk about these episodes or anything else, or provide a recommendation of where you should get started watching Star Trek based on your own personal likes and dislikes. So with that,
as you can tell, we will talk about it at length.
That's right. So with that being said, hopefully everyone's having a very Merry Christmas, and we'll see you in a few days for the 2018 Clip Show. See you then, everyone.
Live long and prosper.
Everyone.